The Public Broadcasting Service, better known as PBS, has earned a reputation for being one of the most trusted institutions in the United States. Americans have consistently trusted PBS in comparison to commercial broadcasting, cable media, newspapers, and internet sources for years. However, earning that reputation has not come easy, as the public broadcaster has run into controversies surrounding its biases. In this video, we'll overview how PBS has evolved from its early days to the present. PBS's history begins with the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, which issued a congressional charter for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB. The CPB is a private, non-profit funded by taxpayers that disperses grants to public broadcasters across the U.S. With this charter, PBS was founded in 1969 by 4 public broadcasters: Hartford N. Gunn, Jr., Kenneth A. Christensen, John W. Macy, Jr., and James Day. The CPB would also go on to create National Public Radio, or NPR, the following year. Both PBS and NPR are both publicly funded nonprofit media entities, but the main difference is that NPR produces and owns its content. PBS connects public television stations across the country and distributes programming. PBS's creators wanted the station to serve a multitude of functions, but primarily educate, entertain, and express a diversity of viewpoints. According to their mission statement, PBS empowers individuals to achieve their potential and strengthen the social, democratic, and cultural health of the U.S. At the same time, they wanted to make sure that PBS was always impartial when covering the news. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 requires the CPB to operate under strict adherence to objectivity and balance in all programs or series of programs of a controversial nature. PBS lived up to these ideals in its early years. For example, they broadcasted the entirety of the opening Watergate hearings nationwide in May of 1973. PBS news anchor Jim Lehrer explained the rationale for this decision to the audience. "We are running it all each day because we think these hearings are important, and because we think it is important that you get a chance to see the whole thing and make your own judgments."
The way I would sum it up is that it's good news, bad news situation. It showed the government of the United States at its absolute worst, and then it showed it at its absolute best. It corrected a wrongdoing, a series of wrongdoings that were unprecedented. But the way it was corrected was also a series of unprecedented doings.
PBS's coverage of the hearings raised its profile. When PBS covered news events in the 70s and 80s, their tone was fairly neutral, and they stuck to the facts on what occurred. Here's a clip of their coverage of President Ronald Reagan's Berlin Wall speech in 1987.
President Reagan paid a visit to the Berlin Wall today and challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear it down. Standing near the Brandenburg Gate overlooking communist East Berlin, Mr. Reagan questioned the Soviet leader's commitment to openness and reform, and he echoed President Kennedy's remark, "I am a Berliner," by saying in German, "There is only one Berlin."
Jim Lehrer and Robert McNeil co-hosted a news program for 20 years. Each segment opened with a short summary of facts on the story, followed by short interviews with special guests and journalists to elaborate on the situation. A good example is PBS's coverage of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. McNeil interviewed 2 student journalists from China, 2 university presidents who specialize in Chinese studies, a Republican U.S. senator, and a Democratic congressman. It also featured a lengthy excerpt from President George H.W. Bush's press conference on the matter. The variety of perspectives contribute to the audience obtaining a well-rounded understanding of the conflict.
What do you think is going to happen next?
Well, I would expect sabotage, terrorist acts among the students or among the general public against the troops, against the government targets. There are already reports in Chengdu that government buildings were on fire.
If it continues, if the violence continues, the U.S. should do other things. What could they be?
Well, the suggestions abound on Capitol Hill. I've heard senators and members of the House suggesting all sorts of economic sanctions, cutting off trade, having a policy of voting against China.
They also fostered political debates with people of different viewpoints. For example, one of their most popular programs was Firing Line, where conservative columnist William F. Buckley Jr. interviewed a variety of guests across the political spectrum, from Republicans like Ronald Reagan to early leaders of the Black Panther Party. Towards the end of the program, an examiner would ask the guest questions. Buckley's conversations with his guests were civil and informative. For example, when Buckley asked then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan about the role of the federal government in handling civil unrest, he allowed Reagan several minutes to detail his policy. Buckley never interrupted Reagan and often summarized his statements at the end for clarification.
You would not attempt to interfere with the price mechanism.
The marketplace is the only answer.
So if gasoline went to $2.50 per gallon, that's the way it would have to be.
Well, what would be the alternative choice?
To subsidize it.
Subsidize it, which means that you'd make the people pay for it in taxes.
That's right.
Instead of the price.
Yeah, you're against that.
I'm against that.
I'm too.
Because it's a little tricky.
Although PBS has maintained its reputation as one of the most trusted and respected news sources, it has not been immune from accusations of bias. PBS's critics have argued that many of its programs are left-leaning or seek to normalize left-wing ideas. One example is an episode titled Sugar Time from the PBS Kids program. Postcards from Buster, which features a lesbian couple with children. Although the episode does not use any LGBTQ terminology or sexual content, critics argued that the episode was inappropriate for children. This can be seen at the end of the episode when the kids of the couple mention they have two mothers.
Is that James?
James, David, and I, and Gillian.
So Gillian's your mom too?
She's my stepmom.
Boy, that's a lot of moms.
In 2003, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting selected Kenneth Tomlinson as its chairman, and he immediately sought to combat the network's perceived liberal bias. PBS greenlit shows with conservative hosts such as Tucker Carlson, Unfiltered, and the Journal Editorial Report, featuring conservative commentators Tucker Carlson and Paul Gigot, respectively.
An estimated 55 million people watched the first presidential debate Thursday night, and according to the many instant polls conducted in its aftermath, a lot of them thought John Kerry scored more points. Kerry was more specific in his critiques, more detailed in his prescriptions. But that doesn't mean he won, because presidential debates aren't like the ones you remember from high school. They're television events, and that's mostly the point. The object is not to out-reason your opponent, but to outshine him.
However, by the end of 2004 and throughout 2005, Tomlinson found himself on thin ice. Reports came out that he and longtime PBS regulars were increasingly at odds with each other, and that his decision-making was politically motivated. Tomlinson resigned from the board in November 2005. The conservative shows he helped bring to PBS ended shortly after. PBS today does not come under the same level of scrutiny of political bias like its competitors, but the public broadcaster has still faced accusations of leaning left. For example, in 2021, one of their attorneys resigned after a video surfaced of them likening former President Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler and called for his supporters' children to be in re-education camps. PBS released a statement that the attorney's comments in no way reflect our values or opinions.
What's great is like COVID is spiking in all the red states right now, so that's great.
Why do you think so?
Because either those people will come out to vote for Trump, because the red states, or a lot of them are sick and dying.
Overall, Biasly rates PBS as somewhat liberal in its biases. Its computer algorithms and analysts rate PBS's reliability as fair and excellent, respectively. PBS's policy leanings are center-left, and they tend to cover politicians negatively. For more information on Biasly's rating on PBS and other media sources, check out biasly.com.